Good morning, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here and to present God's Word. Try to stay as much as I can with just the chapters since we're doing the book of Daniel, and might as well follow it very, very closely. But I do have some background information I'd like to give from time to time. But today will be Daniel chapter 8. I've got some things around me that I bring and I've searched through while I'm studying. And sometimes I get too involved and read too much in the other places. But it's always good to have something along. Well, I didn't mean to do that.
Now you don't have one.
There we go. I brought along some history books. And I have 5 of these, oldies but goodies. This one's General History by Myers. And I also have sectional, I don't know what it's called, I guess Ancient History. It's probably called Ancient History by Myers. But that was a real good standby book back in the 50s and 60s. And one of these books, this one here, I think it is, or maybe, no, I guess it's the other one, has my name in it from original. This is The World Progress by West. And in the front it says Edward Lewin 10D, which was the room of my class in grade 10, and room 206. Way back then, ASHS, Abbotsford Senior Secondary School. This was my history book that I studied of as a grade 10 student in school. I still have it, and it's still very valid in many ways. It's great to look up some of the old history, which is left out of the newer books because they got to compile it. And people don't want to read that much anymore, I guess, anyway. But I was interested in history, and don't remember doing that great in it, but I guess I passed. But it was enjoyable all along. In this book, I found a page stuck in here, but I thought I want to read just a teeny bit that I had marked one time. It says here that there is new ruling class that happened in the Roman Empire as it was declining, things going wrong. And this new ruling class was densely, I think is the way the word is there, ignorant. They were the ruling class. Oh, guess where the rest stood? How did that happen? And I'm not going to go into how many years. But actually, when the Holy Roman Empire took over, the priests decreased the people's ability to learn. They took away their Bible readings, they took away their books, they destroyed books, they destroyed schools, they took away all means of learning, and so that the people were losing. Now, when you read from the King James Bible, or older Bibles, and you get the sense of whether the people were ignorant or smart or taught of God and how much they knew and what they didn't know, even the book of Psalms and Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, the wisdom and knowledge. Wow, there's nothing slow about that at all. I have a guess they're looking after. As we look into even the book of Genesis here, we know that they were very smart people. God taught them. They had their language, they had their alphabet, they had their way of writing. There was a lot of spiritual well-being, and they were smart people. They didn't start off in this world as ignorant and dumb and stupid, rubbing sticks together and so on. They started right off with the sacrifice, right? God taught them how to sacrifice. They had to have fire for that. So day one, in there, God was looking after the people and teaching them, and a lot of wisdom. Further down this page it says, for the whole 400 years when the church was was being ruled over by the popes, and another place here, I'll mention how many there. That time frame, 400 years, was called the Dark Ages. And that comes up in a number of bits of history. If you look at the Travels of Marco Polo, it's a movie, a video. And when you were to watch that and consider it, think about it, you realize, wow, the truths that will come through, where he had gone to foreign countries, or a number of foreign countries, and ended up in China, and then come back, and he showed this in Europe to the archbishops and bishops and so on, and the Catholic Church leaders. They said, no, that doesn't exist. While he was there with his own eyes, his own mind, he saw what they had. They had paper money, they had black powder explosives, they had a compass, but the European leaders said, no, that doesn't exist. And you better recant of it or you're going to go to the hot place. They squashed all knowledge and all abilities to read and so on. So another place in here, just, well, the word I wanted to catch is that it was called the Dark Ages. And they had to break out of the Dark Ages in order to come back to the light. But that's not the way it was when Jesus was here. They were not stupid people. In fact, they marveled at the wisdom of Jesus and the disciples, and they had not been schooled as such, and yet they had a lot of wisdom, knowledge, and so on that came from the scriptures. From year 400 to 800, well, we won't get there today. We're still before Christ in the book of Daniel where we're at. But I wanted you to know that these books exist, and you can look up the information about Daniel and about all these kingdoms that ruled. We went through the Babylonian kingdom, chapter 2 there in Daniel. And then after that was the Medes, or the Medes and Persians, because they did work together, and we'll see a little of that today, of how they ended up being stronger by it being double. And then there was the Greek Empire that came after that, and then the Roman Empire after that. Well, that's retold in chapter 7 and chapter 8. So we're right at that right now. Okay, that's what we've got. And one last thing they say in here, Europe remained a dreary scene of violence, lawlessness, and ignorance. And yet that, especially Rome, was the center of the religious system. And they had an eastern arm of it and a western arm of it, and it says that situation of it. When people were forced to obey and to be what they deemed as religious, and it didn't help their intelligence and whatever, because it was wrong anyway. Nowadays, I guess that's not politically correct, is it? People don't want to hear that. But that's just regular history. I'm reading right out of the book. I didn't invent that. I didn't say things nasty on my part. I just read what was already known and understood. This book from Myers has a section in it called Medieval and Modern History. And then a little further back, it's got another one on some more of the taking over of the Western Empire by government. And it says the restoration of the Western Empire in 800. It names who was doing what at that time. It's on this next page, I guess, where I had a number of things underlined. Well, this was about Constantine and the Sabbath and Sunday idea and the distress that went on during that time. I'll leave that for another date. But if you didn't have those kind of history books, this book by Halley's Bible Handbook has a lot of history in it, right along with your pages of the chapters of the Bible. So you can look up Daniel in here, and you'd read about what the prophecies are all about and where they're going to head. And you know, by the time you get to the end of the book of Daniel, you're way in the future of our time even. But much of it was 2, 3, 4, 5, even 600 years before Christ. It was prophesying what was coming. And he points it out in here and uses archaeology in here as well. So these are good books to grab up and look up some of the things. Oh, and I marked a couple of things because I never want to neglect these in the back. It's got a section called Church History. When I told you about some of it in here already, about how bad it was, you can look up who did what. Who was the head of the church when such and such happened? When did they say that they were the vicar of Christ? When did they say that they were God on earth? It's here. I didn't make it up. It's history. And there's a lot of pages on that. And then they've got another piece in the back, the habit of Bible reading. You wonder why I push it so much? It's just a good thing to do, okay? To read the Bible and to know the Bible, know the Scriptures. We run into a little piece I wanted to state from this one writing that I have, and then I'll move on to the Bible itself. I'll put these down before I knock them over. You heard about the guy that always wore his watch. He'd take it off and put it up here so he could watch his time. And he'd get excited and, oh, shouldn't have broke my pocket watch. And the same story said, well, why does the preacher use this watch on the inside? And I've always, from the time I first got a wristwatch, it was always on the inside of my arm. And they joked in that same record, they said, the preacher can be preaching away and he can point to the Holy Land and check, I got 5 minutes left. Anyway, time in the Scriptures, times in here, we'll talk about some of that as well. But here it says, every student of history knows, and that's not my writing, this is out of a book that I photocopied last night. It says, every student of history knows that there is just one new and different power which arose as a Roman Empire fell. And I remember reading that way back when I was in ministerial school, and when the teacher, Brother John Keyes, was teaching, and he was teaching about the Roman Empire, and it lasted over to here, but somewhere along the way this other power got stronger, and got stronger and stronger, and pretty soon it was called the Holy Roman Empire, with the head as the Pope of the church. So he says, every student of history knows that there is just one thing that happened different when it was falling. And then they add in the end of that sentence, and that power was the papacy. And then it talks about it was developed in Europe. The so-called Christendom was ruled by 5 bishops, and the Bishop of Jerusalem, the Bishop of Antioch, the Bishop of Constantinople, the Bishop of Alexander, the Bishop of Rome. Wow. Ruled the world. Yeah, that's right. They ruled the world. It wasn't the kings and the emperors leading that ruled. It was actually the Catholic Church that was ruling. And read that. Look it up. Find out when they got a little break from it. When did the Catholic Church go down somewhat? And when the governments of the world began to have their power again. So in this chapter 8, well, I want to look maybe just briefly at what I had in this chapter 8 over here from my text. You can see the rottiness of it from 1962. It's had a few years. But in here it talks about the empire that we're reading about. The chapter 8, it gives 2 sentences. The ram with the 2 horns, one higher than the other, represents the Medo-Persian Empire. So if we kind of to put that in the back of your mind, that these animals represented kingdoms. The horns represented the leaders of those countries, or the kings of those countries. If you start looking at it that way, you get that in your thinking and in your way of doing things, and as you go along, it'll get into understanding books like Ezekiel and some of the others in the Old Testament, but also the book of Revelations, and that's where the real aim is, to understand what the symbolism means. What is a horn? What is an animal in prophecy and understanding prophecy? Then another sentence under this was the he-goat represents the Grecian Empire, with Alexander the Great the first king. Yep. So that helps you to understand this animal that came, why it says he-goat, but you have to make sure goats have male and female, so to make sure this was a male goat with the big horns ready to fight, I guess. And so that's there. Then there's a little section on chapter 8 through 12 of Daniel 8. Like the four heads of the leopard-colored beast, these four horns, which came out of Alexander's Grecian Empire, represent four kingdoms. Out of one of the four horns came a fourth, a little horn. Not, right in brackets here, not the same as the little horn of chapter 7, which came up among the 10. So you have to, when you're thinking about these different stories, you have to say, where is this horn coming from? And back there in chapter 7, we had an animal with 10 horns. And remember, one little one started coming up and 3 went down. That's a different story than this little horn that's here. This little horn is a different person. And then it says, after a bracket there, namely out of the Syrian division, the four kingdoms that Alexander left when he left his realm, died and so on, he left it in 4 generals' controls. One of those 4 was the Syrian division. This horn was Antiochus Epiphanes. So you can take that name, look it up in Google, or, it's on the computers nowadays, or you can look it up in old history books. Look up who he was and what he did and how bad he was. He's a real bad guy. Who cast down and defiled the sanctuary in Jerusalem for a period of 2,300 days, and in brackets, evenings and mornings. The Bible doesn't use S's on the ends of those words. Check it out. That can have a different meaning, right? Okay. In 171 BC was the beginning of the host being trodden underfoot. And by 168 BC, the sanctuary was defiled, and at 165, it was cleansed. So just 3 years there, and then the temple was cleansed again. When you think about the length of the United States being in existence, a couple hundred years, and you go back to this and you say this was only a couple hundred years or 150 years before Jesus was here on earth. Interesting. What kind of a world did Jesus come into? And when he was speaking to the people, what kind of background did they have? They could remember great-grandma and grandpa. They could remember what was taught just those few hundred years back. What kind of history they had a couple hundred years back, or 150 years back. We're not doing too bad when we look back at 1800s, early 1800s. We know what was going on. Well, that would be like the people that Jesus was speaking to and what the disciples were speaking to. They could remember back there when such and such happened. Okay. And if you want a story, it mentions one line here, but if you want the story, and it's a scary one, don't read it before bedtime. The Maccabees. It's recognized as a historical fact, the book of Maccabees. And there's book number 1, book number 2. They're thin books in scripture type size books. But it tells exactly what Antiochus Epiphanes did to the Hebrew people. Very scary, very torture and terrible stuff that they did, trying to force the Hebrew people to leave their God, to leave their culture, and go into the world, forgetting all of the religious backgrounds. They just wanted to wipe that out, didn't really. So, I want to take a look at chapter 8, and I've got a few notes here on the side, but it's really all right there in the Bible. So let's go straight to Daniel. Put my paper, there we go, right to the right spot. Chapter 8. Ready? Verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. You know what, right there you got to stop and you say, isn't this out of sequence? Yeah, it is. Because this takes you right back to chapter 5, verse 1. When Belteshazzar got going. So this is like a recap or going back and saying, this also happened at that time. Okay. So under this time frame of the Belshazzar, in the 3rd year of his reign, this was happening to Daniel. And he had a vision. But he's saying it wasn't quite the same as the first one. First vision that he had. And verse 2, it says, I saw a vision, and it came to pass, and I saw that I was at Shushan in the palace in the province of Elam, and I saw in a vision, and I was by the river Ulan. What you can do is just take your Bible, go to the back where the maps are, and look these places up. Then you can kind of superimpose over it today's countries and look up who would be there. And you can see things like where Babylon was, you can see where Nineveh was, you can see where Ur of the Chaldees were, and they're mentioned as well here later than just Abraham's time. Ur of the Chaldees were still there. You can look up where Media was, and you look up where Persia was, and know that they joined together. Elam is mentioned right there at the top end of the Persian Gulf. Think about the modern countries that are there now. Who's there now? Very interesting. So a friend of mine used to say from Missouri, I'd tell him something and he'd say, very interesting. But it is really. And I turn one page in here and it's got the Babylonian Empire, and it shows you the Babylonian kingdom in purple, and it's written in there, and where Babylon was, where Persia was, where the Medes' kingdom was in that picture. And then the next page is the Greek Empire, and you can look up cities in there. Interesting to find those connections, to say, where are you? Where's north? How many miles is that from Jerusalem to that place over in the east? They didn't go straight across the desert, they went this way. They went on a curved route because that was the crescent, they used to call it, the vegetation and so on, that was really good there because of the rivers and so on. People could travel and have food. So you could actually find Shushan in some of those. And those rivers that I mentioned, what province he was in, it's easy enough to find those. When I lifted up my eyes and saw in verse 3, and there stood before the river a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, and one was higher than the other, and the higher came up last. So you've got these 2 kingdoms that are going to come up. One is taller, stronger, whatever, back and forth. These kind of seesaw situations are happening. The horns, again, from what we've already learned, are kingdoms or kings. So then we go into verse 4. I saw a ram pushing westward, northward, southward, so that no beast might stand before him, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, and he did according to his will, and became great. Alexander the Great. He controlled it all. He could go this way, he could go that way, he could go that way, he could go that way, and he could control it all. He had such power, such amazing power. Verse 5. And as I was considering, the he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth, and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. So here's a different kind of an animal than a horn between his eyes instead of 2 horns. So a horn between his eyes. And he was coming from the west, from that direction. And yet he was having all this power, so powerful that he could just float over the earth and he'd control it. Okay? So when we look in history, we can try to fit these in. see who had that kind of power, right after the Babylonian power and after the Medo-Persian power. And it came, verse 6, and he came to the ram that had 2 horns, and he had seen, that I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him with fury and in his power. And I saw him come close to the ram, and was moved with choler against him, and smote the ram, and brake his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to stand before him, and he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. So 2 horns, Medo-Persia. Somebody came from the west, which was a Greek power that's going to be the next ruling world ruler. And he came over, and nobody could stand in his way. He could stamp them down, crush them, be nasty to them, break their horns, break their power. So now we're down to verse 8. Before the heat waxed very great, therefore the goat waxed very great. No wonder he's called Alexander the Great. The great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones towards the 4 winds of heaven. 4 directions again that they came from. But the original horn was broken, so Alexander the Great died. Fairly young, he died. But his power went to 4 generals that he had at that time. So 4 notable horns, rulers, kings, came up. And you could follow this just in history. You could write dates on the side of your Bible, but you could put down dates. And out of them came forth a little horn which waxed exceedingly great. So out of the 4, one of them was a little horn that became great, towards the south and towards the east and towards the pleasant land. Sometimes we refer to the promised land or the pleasant land. That was where the children of Israel lived. So he came toward them and included them in his takeovers. And he waxed great even so to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and the stars to the ground and stamped on them. The stars, I had a note here to go back and think about when Joseph had his dream, and he was going to have the stars bow down to him, and the moon and the sun would bow down. It didn't do that physically. The moon didn't do this, and the sun did that. It was his parents, the mom and the dad and the children, that had to come and bow before him. So this is another understanding that this host of heaven doesn't mean that this host, he wasn't controlling heaven itself. He was controlling the church, the leaders of the church. And verse 11, and he magnified himself even to the prince of the host. Interesting. Who was in charge of the city, there in the pleasant land. And if you want to go any higher, I guess God let him get away with it, but he was very powerful. And by him the daily sacrifice was taken away. So he could go into the temple and control. So the children of Israel could not control it. The church priests and Levites couldn't control what was going on. This little horn, this Antiochus Epiphanes is his name in history. He controlled so that he could even stop the daily sacrifice and take it away. And the place of his sanctuary was cast down. He could control everything about the temple service. And a host was given him against the daily sacrifice by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth, controlling the truth of what should be done, to the ground, and practiced and prospered. Then I heard one saint speak to another saint, and said unto that certain saint which spake. So Daniel's listening to these conversations that are going on in front of him. How long shall the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation, to give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. The question was, how long? Daniel didn't ask himself, but he was wondering about it. He didn't be sure. How long? And then this conversation again in the background. And he said unto me, unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. So there's a time frame when this was going to start until the temple would be cleansed. And that's the 2,300 days. And it came to pass, when I, even Daniel, had seen the vision and sought for the meaning, then, behold, there stood before me as the appearance of a man. So somebody else came there and was now going to present to him what this was all about, what kind of a vision this was. And he's still in the vision. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulan River, which called and said, Gabriel, make this man to understand the vision. Gabriel's here. He's in a couple other places in the Bible. Right? My margin says it's in chapter 9:21, which is the next chapter, and also in Luke 1:19 and 26. So sometimes the margin really helps you to look over and find out where these things are, who Gabriel was. Verse 17. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. And he said unto me, understand, O Son of Man, for at the time of the end shall be the vision. The question then is, which end? The end of the whole world? Or the end of the Old Testament, you might say, the end of this story? When Jesus is going to come and things are going to change. The end of the Old Testament. And Jesus is going to come, things are going to change. So keep those in mind, because there's going to be more about this later. I wrote in there in my Bible. I wrote in more coming, more later. Verse 18. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep, on my face towards the ground, and he touched me and set me upright. He picked him up, stood him upright. And he said, behold, I will make thee know. He's going to make you know what this is all about. That shall be the end in the last days of indignation, for the time appointed the end shall be. And again, I wrote in there, is this the Old Testament, question mark, you know? But when is this end going to be? When is this going to come to a stop? Verse 20, the ram which thou sawest, having two horns are, now I thought I was the one that figured that. I didn't figure nothing out, it's right there, right? God always tells us ahead of time. So the ram that you saw and had two horns are kings of the Medes and the Persians. So there you are. No worry about it. History books even, it's right there. I didn't have to figure it out. God just already wrote it down for us. And the rough goat, the he-goat, remember? We were guessing maybe. No, it's right here, right here. Is the king of Grecia, or Greece. And the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. And he was the great, and he was broken. That's Alexander the Great, so we can look it up and say, okay, we know where that is in history. Verse 22, now that being broken, whereas four stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. They're not going to have the same kind of powers as Alexander the Great, but there's going to be 4 of them taking his place. And at the bottom of the page there, I wrote Alexander the Great, put an asterisk up to the first king, and then we go on to the other 4. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors are come to a full, a king of fierce countenance and understanding dark sentences shall stand up. One of these is going to be notable now, especially to the children of Israel. And his power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. And we know that He's getting power from Satan for sure. And he shall destroy wonderfully, and shall prosper and practice and destroy the mighty and the holy people. He's going to make his attack on the holy city, on the worship system, and on the children of Israel. In verse 25, and through his policy, also he shall cause craft to prosper, probably the bad kind of craft, maybe the making of idols and so on. And he shall magnify himself in his heart, get swelled up, have pride. And peace shall destroy many by his peace. Remember, we read in the New Testament when they say peace and safety, be careful. You know, it's not going to be there. Well, this was in their time as well. He's going to claim peace. I'll make it all better for you if you just obey me. You know, we'll give you better times. And in my margin, it has prosperity. Not just the word peace, but they're going to preach prosperity. Okay. And he shall also stand up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken without hand. You think, okay, the children of Israel, they need to fight now. Get out your swords and you're going to go and fight these people. He's going to be broken without hands. You don't have to do anything. God's going to take care of it. I like that. God says he can use the bees and he can use the wild animals and wasps and all kinds of things. If you read the Old Testament, you'll know what I'm talking about. We really do need to read the Bible, or we can be told a story that doesn't work. God can control those. I love the John and Catherine Keyes that sang a song that said that if this room was filled with bees, you wouldn't have to be asked to leave. God doesn't make you go against your will, he just makes you willing to go. Okay, verse 26. And the vision of the evening, singular, and the morning, singular, which was told is true. Wherefore shut up the vision, for it shall be for many days. They're not going to understand this for many days, but it's closed. And it's about the evening and morning sacrifices, which when you go back and study history and so on, you'll find out that they had to do a sacrifice in the morning and sacrifice in the evening. But if it's 1,200 years and you talk about the sacrificing themselves, it's going to be, what, 1130 years? Then you start looking at history and, oh, really? And it works. Okay? But keep those things in mind as you go through and try to find history and make it match with Daniel, the book of Daniel. And verse 27, and I, Daniel, fainted and was sick certain days. This was such a pressure on his mind to try to understand and to see how terrible things could be or going to get worse for the children of God, children of Israel. It made him sick to think of what's coming next after his time, because he's still here in the 4 kings that he served under. You know, the 2 for Babylon, and about 2 for the Medo-Persians, Persian leader, and the Medes leader. So he was sick certain days, and then he rose up and did the king's business, and was astonished at the vision. He was wondering about it. He didn't understand it all yet, but none understood it. He couldn't ask for any help anywhere else. He had to depend on God's help. So a very interesting way of looking at that chapter. So in here we had, if I just make a brief summary, in this chapter we had the 2nd and 3rd world empires that come up. And it's very much like what was explained in chapter 2 and chapter 7, those animals. And we have the Median, the Medo-Persian, or the Persian power, right? Along with the Greek Empire. So the Medes and the Persian meld together into one government, one control. And then the Greek Empire overthrew them. The Persian Empire, represented by the devouring bear, is here represented as two-horned ram, being the coalition of the Medes and the Persians. The Greek Empire, pictured here in chapter 7, verse 6, as a four-horned leopard, four-headed leopard, is here portrayed as a swift he-goat, bounding furiously from the west, having one great horn, which when broken was replaced by four horns. Okay, if you remember, we were reading through that. The great horn was Alexander the Great, who broke the Persian Empire in 331 BC. This prophecy was written about 539 BC, 200 years before its fulfillment. We have to use history to figure that one out, to say this is what was prophesied and it really came to pass. And we got dates to match. That makes you believe in God. Believe in the scriptures. God said he'll let us know ahead of time. And if we can believe in the scriptures, we can believe in the Heavenly Father for who he really is, and that he's really concerned about our welfare, and we can give our allegiance to him, and he will take care of us. The four horns are four heads from these verses in chapter 7 as well as here in chapter 8. Alexander's empire was divided in four pieces. His generals, as I told you. The little horn which rose out of the four is generally agreed to mean Antiochus Epiphanes. That's not me, that's from Halley's Bible Handbook. Okay, I just got a bigger page over here than the little book. But that's from Halley's Bible Handbook. I just photocopied and blew up the page so I could see it a little easier. And Antiochus Epiphanes was from 175 to 164 BC of the Syrian branch of the Greek Empire, who made a determined effort to stamp out Jewish religion. So those things do match in history. I pray we can keep going and learn more about Daniel, which will help us to see more of the book of Revelation. May God bless you.